Content warning. Episodes of Grey Matter may contain themes and depictions of extreme mental illness, traumatic bodily harm, and death. If you aren't in the right headspace to engage with those depictions right now, maybe this episode should wait for another time. Otherwise, proceed with caution.
Hi there. Welcome back to Grey Matter Video. Let me ask you something. Does it feel old in here to you? Or stale? Musty? Dusty? Rusty? Okay, forget the last one. Just pretend I had another word that rhymed. Either way, we haven't had a lot of business lately, and I can't help but wonder if that means the sun is finally setting on the once proud era of the VHS tape. What's that? 30 years? Holy shit, no wonder we don't get any customers. Maybe I'll talk to management about sprucing the place up a little bit. Finally order some of those newfangled laser discs. What was I saying? Oh yeah, sometimes the past can feel so distant, like the stained layers of fragmentary rock lining the jagged side of a ravine. But sometimes the past can feel alive. There's a vitality to it, a pounding heartbeat that thrums out through time to remind us of things we'd prefer to forget. But we can't. Not as long as linear time drags us forward, from fish to lizard to ape to man. And until we live in a world without history, the past will always matter. This tape is called The Shadow over Innsmouth, and I think it'll show you what I mean. As long as you can get past the smell. The Shadow over Innsmouth. Written and directed by Jonathan Inbody, and adapted from the novella of the same name by H.P. Lovecraft.
I was always a sickly child, ill and thin. My mother told me it was the result of a childhood fight against an unknown infection, and although the worst of it was long behind me, I remained afraid of sickness. That, perhaps more than anything, led me to a career in the field of public health. In the early days of the pandemic, as the mystery flu the world was only just starting to know as COVID-19 was washing over China and spilling out through the docks and airports, I was standing on the cutting edge. My mentor, a career epidemiologist named Lake, brought me as his assistant and tag-along on a United Nations humanitarian mission to one of the hardest-hit regions. There, we got sick. Lake died. I didn't. While he was hospitalized, intubated, and finally given meager palliative care as his body withered and his organs failed, I sat in a quarantined hotel room with a slight fever and a cough. At first, I sat and wondered how I came to be spared, aside from the obvious difference in age. But after the first few days, my cough began to feel familiar. It was just like the chronic cough I'd had as a boy, some strange combination of wet and wheezy, and the sides of my neck just beneath my jaw swelled and ached exactly like they used to. When I scratched my arm and found a patch of itchy, flaking skin, the kind of eczema I hadn't gotten since grade school, I knew my condition, my sickness, whatever it had been. It was protecting me. I recovered within the week, but the old familiar cough stayed with me as I returned to America and lingered for the next few months as I mourned and stewed. I had tried to explain to my classmates, my professors, but without hard data, no one would listen. I had just gotten lucky. That's what they said. But I knew it wasn't true. There was an answer I knew my mother hid from me before she died. And although she was gone, I knew there was one place left I could go for answers. A town only scarcely mentioned among the papers and family heirlooms she kept in a cluttered old storage unit. It was listed as the city of origin on my mother's birth certificate, and the town's name sounded just familiar enough that I thought she might have mentioned it before. Innsmouth was a small coastal town on the rural end of Massachusetts, a half-deserted fishing village cut off from the rest of the civilized world by miles of salt marshes. According to the scant sources I could find, it began as a bustling port and a work town for shipbuilders during the Revolutionary War, then languished through the late 1800s as the railroads undercut their shipping business. It wasn't until after World War II, when a sailor named Obadiah Marsh started a gold refinery, that the town showed back up in the newspapers. For a while, times were good. I found articles about Obed Marsh marrying his daughters off to wealthy socialites, and pictures of him shaking hands with every powerful person he can get into the same room with. Then, abruptly, the town of Innsmouth closed its doors to the outside world. There were rumors of a smallpox outbreak brought in through the docks from overseas, but if there was any truth to it, the marshes seemed to have almost completely covered it up. According to census data, the town of Innsmouth lost almost half its population that year. The outbreak, whatever it was, subsided, but the town never recovered. And now, it barely existed. But what if the shadow of death hanging over Innsmouth never went away? What if the sickness remained, using the isolated townsfolk as a reservoir? And what if that illness, and whatever strange immunity it had conferred, had somehow helped to stave off the virus that had killed the man I looked up to as a father? The possibility haunted me, tortured me, as I watched the coronavirus ravage Italy and make its way towards America, more than ready to usher in an age of overstuffed hospitals and portable morgues. And when it began to spread in New York, roll over the boroughs like tar and spill out into the suburbs, I realized I no longer had the luxury of time. So, with a statewide shutdown looming, I took a train out of Boston and transferred onto a ramshackle bus route, the only so-called reliable way to get into Innsmouth short of renting a car. If there was even the slightest possibility that somewhere in Innsmouth sat the secret to some treatment, some medicine that could turn the tide of a global pandemic, I had no choice but to take that chance. Everything that I had learned prepared me for the sight of Innsmouth, but nothing could have prepared me for the smell. There was a thick, fishy odor that surrounded the town for miles, wafting out through the squat black buildings and over the sloping roofs. I thought I might have been able to see it, rising up in heat lines over the run-down docks and the rotted, dredged-up ships that lined the rocky shore. But as the old bus lurched closer, I realized it was only low-hanging fog. The whole place seemed damp, hostile to life but teeming with it, as though hermit crabs, seabirds, and barnacles made up more of its population than people. And, given the state of the narrow streets and dilapidated sidewalks, that might not have been an exaggeration. The bus stopped at a curb across from a squat, gray cobblestone square with a once ornate fountain, and I heard the doors hiss open from my seat all the way at the back. I sidled up the narrow row, watching the other three riders as they shuffled out ahead. And when I passed the driver, I tried not to stare. He was a lumpy, flat-faced man, his mouth permanently turned downward into a half-grimace, with eyes wide and bulging. His skin was clammy, and his breathing loud. And I was glad to be finished with him, even as he grunted out an emotionless goodbye while I passed with my bag. The smell was even worse, somehow, when you stood in the open air. Perhaps it was carried inland with the damp fog, soaked into clothes and clammy skin day after day until you looked like the bus driver. I decided, right then and there, that I'd rather be dead. If I carried the smell of this place with me when I went, I'd want to go out like my uncle, a gun in his mouth and a smile on his face, intent on painting the wall with the brain that had caused him so much strife. It was a cruel, grim thought to judge a quaint colonial town with the eyes, ears, and nostrils of a persnickety academic. Past the dilapidated fountain was a tall, sloping building with a dangling wooden sign that read, Gilman House, in burnt-in letters. A hotel, maybe? A bed and breakfast? Behind me, I heard a sudden hiss and a thunk as the bus's engine cut off. I jumped, glancing back as the driver waddled away, then sighed and shook my head. The bus was scheduled to leave Innsmouth tonight. I had made sure of it, but it made me nervous to even contemplate being stuck here overnight. I decided against the hotel and went into a small market, where a young-looking cashier was reading a book behind the counter. Excuse me. Hello. I'm Ross Olmsted. I just got to town, and this might seem a little strange, but...
Around here, everything's a little strange. What can I do for you?
Well, you noticed, huh?
What? The fact that this place looks like it still burns witches, or that the people here blink one eye at a time?
Oh, thank God. I've got to tell you, I was really afraid that everyone here was going to look like my bus driver.
Well, most of the locals do. Folks around Arkham call it the Innsmouth look. That kind of wide-eyed, gape-jawed face, like a fish trying to breathe at the end of a hook. As for your bus driver, that'd be Joe Sargent. And trust me, once you get to know him, he's a real peach.
You're not from here, I take it?
No, I usually work up in the city. I got sent here because all of the Innsmouth clerks keep quitting.
Can't imagine why. Listen, I'm here on kind of well, it's a long story, but I'm trying to gather some historical data. Local history, whatever they have. Is there any kind of a town hall or somewhere I could get access to those records?
Yeah, maybe? Not so much of a town hall, but there's a library. If you don't find anything there, you could, try and put a request in with the Marshes.
Can you tell me how to get there?
The library? It's easier if I draw you a map. Hold on.
Wait, the Marsh family is still around?
At least one of them is. People around here call him the Old Man. I've never seen him myself, but people go up to his house and ask him things all the time. I think his kids are up there with him. It's the big one on the hill. You can't miss it. Okay, here. This is the square, and these are the main streets through town. Library's up there. The Marsh place is just past it. I'd be careful about who you go around asking questions to, though. People in Innsmouth are private, around outsiders. A little tense, maybe. They don't like anyone digging into old business. Once every couple of days, I catch one of them staring at me from out the window. Makes my skin crawl.
I can imagine.
And don't go near the churches. There's some kind of not like a secret society, really, but close. Either way, they're not the sort of religious you're used to. If you want to know about them, you can ask Zachariah Allen, if he's sober enough to tell you.
Thanks. Is there... In a second, I saw her face go white. She stared at me in horror as I coughed, backing herself up against the wall. And as I got my fit under control, I tried to give her a reassuring smile. Sorry, I'm sorry to scare you. I swear it's not the coronavirus. I already had it months ago. This is just one of the lingering effects. I'm not contagious.
Good to know.
You can trust me. I know what I'm talking about. I work in epidemiology.
Then what are you doing all the way out here? Why aren't you in New York or California?
Would you be in New York right now if you had any sort of choice about it?
No, guess not. Do you mind if I ask you something?
You've done plenty for me. Go ahead.
This whole thing, this pandemic, do you think it's worth all the trouble? People are saying they're going to call off the rest of the NBA season, or put us in lockdowns like China. Do you really think it's going to be that bad?
Do you want my honest opinion?
Yes.
However bad you think it's going to be, you're underestimating it. If we don't take it seriously as a country, it's going to kill thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. If we're lucky, it won't be millions. But I don't think we'll get that lucky.
I really hope you're wrong.
So do I. Thank you for the map and the information. Sorry, all I had for you was bad news.
It's the only kind there is lately.
I left the shop and followed the cashier's map, quietly delighted at the level of detail she'd managed to put into it in so little time. She'd even added the beginnings of a few streets and crossed them off, warning me where I wouldn't be welcome. It didn't take me too long to get to the library, although I found it closed. It wasn't after hours. It was barely 3. Maybe it was only open certain days of the week. Or maybe, as I joked to myself, they'd locked the doors when they saw me coming. Oh, that'd be a normal one, the librarian would have said. Can't have his kind in here. I looked up at the Marsh family mansion, sitting jagged and uneven on the hill like someone had dropped it there, and decided I would only go there if I had no other choice. I had no intentions of stoking century-old flames, especially if the descendants of Obed Marsh had good reasons for keeping them unlit. I was beginning to suspect that old Obed had done something terrible. Hell, maybe the whole town had. If there really was an outbreak here all those years ago, there was no knowing what the people of Innsmouth would have been willing to do to protect themselves. On the slow walk back towards the square, I took in the sights and sounds of the small seaside town. It could have been nice with a little paint and a metric ton of air fresheners, some cozy retirement village, or a hidden little historic gem for tourists to stumble across. I passed one of the churches and gave it a long, curious look. It looked strange, certainly, with the odd symbol in place of the cross and the sign with the sharp lettering, but it was hardly sinister. The Esoteric Order of Dagon. That's what it said. What a strange place.
May our journeys be long and our spirits be free. So forever we'll always be bound by the call of the time. And our love from the ocean sunk and subside.
I turned my head and watched as a round, bearded old man stumbled down the street, swinging a half-empty bottle as his fisherman's raincoat flapped in the wind. He squinted one eye and stared at me with the other, looking me quickly up and down, then nervously glanced over at the church. I followed his eyes over to the building, where a large, man-like shape behind an open back door quickly slammed it shut. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe Innsmouth's Sunday best was a lot stranger than I'd suspected. But in the split second the dark, robed figure had been visible, I could have sworn he was wearing some kind of frilled, jagged headdress.
Sun water around here. You know it's good for you.
I wasn't... How long was he watching me?
Long enough that ought to make you nervous. Come on. I'll show you back down the bus.
How did you know I came here on the bus?
Where else are you gonna come from? See? You don't look too much like that sort neither.
Sorry? Wait a minute. Are you... You're Zachariah Allen, right? The cashier at the corner store told me I could... She said you might be talkative.
That's me. Talkative. I'm thirsty.
If I buy you another one of those, can I ask you a few questions?
Buy me one of these. I'll tell you anything you like. Oh, not here, though. Prying eyes.
I furrowed my brow and quickly scanned the buildings lining both sides of the street. Most of them seemed abandoned. In every few houses there was one with a boarded-up window or two. Some had hastily drawn shapes carved into the rotting front doors, while others had rusted wind chimes or dangling trinkets on fishing lines hanging off their old porches. Kind of a quiet day today, huh? Doesn't seem like anything's open.
The Gilman's always open.
Why don't we try the corner store? I think I saw some liquor in there.
Doesn't matter much to me.
When we made it back to the town square, I ducked into the market and grabbed Mr. Allen a similar-looking bottle. As the cashier rang me up, she looked out the window behind me and chuckled.
You found him, huh?
He found me, more like.
Listen, we're closing a little early tonight, in like 15 minutes or so. My car is parked a few blocks over. I can drop you off wherever, if you need a ride.
Oh, thank you. That's really nice of you, but I'll be taking the 8 o'clock bus.
I wouldn't stay here after dark. Some of the people here, the ones with the Innsmouth look, there are ones that have it better, and there are some that have it worse. The ones that have it worse come out at night.
What are they like?
Deformed, disfigured, like something ate away at their faces.
Like leprosy, you mean? Or syphilis? Parts of their bodies rotted away, falling off.
Certain parts. They hide it pretty well, but they lose noses, fingers, most of their hair. They get bloated, clammy, like fish left out too long in a market.
Interesting. Is that why there's all the boarded-up houses? Boarded-up rooms?
Look, have you looked at your phone lately?
Oh, I gave up. Signal's too bad.
Well, you were right about the virus. Cities are getting locked down, states, the whole country is closing up. If you don't get out of here now, there's no telling when the next time you'll be able to get back home is. Or when help could get to you.
I can't. Not yet.
Whatever you're after here, it's not going to be good for you.
If I leave, it'll be worse for everyone. Zachariah and I walked, and Zachariah ambled, down to the rocky shore a half-mile down the beach from the rotted docks. There, he sprawled out on a rusted bench, and I sat down beside him, eyeing him cautiously as he took one long swig after another of the liquor I'd just bought him. Finally, when he seemed to be satisfied, he smacked his lips and looked out at the sea.
What's your name, son?
Ross Olmsted.
You have dreams, Ross?
What?
What is it you're after here, boy?
Answers. I want to know about the Innsmouth look. Where did it come from?
The ocean.
Overseas? I know there was some kind of outbreak. Half the town died.
They surely did.
But it wasn't the illness, was it? The people of Innsmouth did something terrible, didn't they? Some scheme cooked up by Obed Marsh and paid for by all his gold?
Take care who you say that to.
Yeah, I've been warned about the locals' hospitality. Have you always lived here?
And my father before me. And his father too. And more. A long way back.
Your father told you what happened back then, didn't he?
See that black spot out there in the water? Just past the edge of the bay? It's called Devil's Reef. Out past it is where the deep water starts. There's things down there that ain't been seen in generations.
Is there a plague ship out there? Somewhere on the bottom? When the sickness was spreading, all those people didn't die of natural causes, did they?
My father said there was a storm that night. The high-ups in the esoteric order, Obed and his deputies, they had a secret meeting. They drew lots. Elias Waite lost. He had to steer the ship. The others rounded up a crowd. All the folks liked him and forced everyone else onto the boat. Waite steered it right into the reef. Anyone that didn't drown got shredded on the rocks or ate up by things in the water below. My father, he said he couldn't hear the screams, not looking out his window at the shore. He could see distant bodies struggling in the surf. From then on, the order, the marshes, decided everything. Everyone left had to go to their church, take their oaths, make their sacrifices. That ship, those people, it was a gift, you understand? An offering to the sea. To Obed's God and all its mermaid angels.
What kind of god did Obed worship?
Maybe the oldest one. Or maybe just the priest for the others.
And to get more people into his church, he spun a mass killing of the sick into a holy sacrament?
I didn't say he killed the sick. Obed killed the healthy.
What? Why?
Because his sacrifice, Innsmouth's sacrifice, was one end of the deal he made years before. He told folks the sickness would pass, but he didn't tell them it was his food that was causing it, drawn in by his fishermen. They had some of their blood in it. Some of them. And their blood's stronger than ours. Slicker. Well, it couldn't take hold in just one generation. There wasn't enough flesh to beat ours out, but after a few marriages, a few kids, it was strong enough to start to change. By now, there's only a few families left. A few folks left. And I don't like them. Normal, healthy folks that don't lose pieces as they get older. Unless there's nothing left for them to do but go under the water.
Kill themselves, you mean? Walk into the bay?
No. When they can't get around on land anymore, or they can't stand the way normal folks look at them, they go to join the deep ones.
The what?
The deep ones. The devil spawn of Mother Hydra and Father Dagon. The things like fish that wanted to be things like us. You know, Obed found them out there in that deep, dark crack beneath the reef. He made a deal. They showed him their city. Their god offered him all the gold he could carry and all the fish he could catch if he found them folks to mix their blood with. Because those things with fins and claws and teeth, they wanted arms and legs. Not weak and vestigial, but strong. Oh, strong enough to walk on land again. To get things ready for their god to rise up. Oh, they don't die like we do. Not of old age. Only if they're killed. And they can hardly breed with their own. And when they do, they eat their young. So to grow their number, they need us.
What are you... Oh, are you serious? I'm trying to figure out what's going on around here, and you're... You're gonna tell me ghost stories about fish people? You must really think you're funny, playing a prank on the big city idiot.
It's not a joke. My father never took the third oath. You see, he never mixed himself with them and theirs. Never took one of them into his house to make mother of his kin. They left him alone. They leave me alone because they know I can't stop them. They got what they wanted for most of the century now, and the young ones are strong. They got weapons down there too. You know, things so horrible. You ever hear tell of a Shaggoth?
Get away from me, you drunk!
You'll wish you listened, boy. When the esoteric order's dancing on Devil's Reef and the water's turning all around them, full of red-eyed things, Shin, Cthulhu, Pentagon, oh, you'll... No! I didn't tell him nothing. Please, I've always been good, haven't I? Never done wrong.
I whirled around to look at Zachariah as he stared at the waves rolling onto the beach, his face pale and eyes wide. He was pointing out into the harbor, at a few long wakes out past the breakers where something must have been moving underwater. Whatever it was moving towards land. And as I got closer, Zachariah turned and started to run. He tripped and fell into the sand, cutting his hands on the sharp rocks littering the beach. And as I watched, he drunkenly loped towards the docks and peeled off into an alley between two run-down warehouses. When I looked back at the water, the distant ripples of the wake lines were gone. With the sky growing dark and the time approaching 8, I made my way back towards the town square with the fountain, where the bus was waiting to take me away from this god-forsaken town. I felt like a fool to have come here at all, and even more of one to leave empty-handed. Here in the real world, people died for no good reason, and superstitious yokels offered up human sacrifices to non-existent gods. They thought they could change the world too, and they were just as wrong as I was. When I turned into the town square, I saw bloated Joe Sargent leaning into the engine of his ancient bus underneath an open hood. He was muttering to himself, fiddling with something and turning a tightened wrench. As I got closer, I could hear him saying some foreign words under his breath that I didn't recognize. Whatever he was speaking, the rhythm and punctuation of obscenities was a universal language. Everything all right?
It won't turn over. Something busted.
Oh. Can you fix it?
Not without parts.
I'm not getting out of here at 8, am I? Are there any other routes? Other buses?
Shut down on account of the virus. No routes rescheduled just yet.
What about somewhere to rent a car?
Not tonight. Stay at the Gilman. He'll give you a discount if you show him your ticket.
Is there anywhere else? A Four Seasons, maybe? Thanks. After half a minute of getting the courage up, I crossed the square and entered Gilman House. Inside, a tall, bald man with the Innsmouth look flipped through a dusty book in search of an open room, then stopped and wrote my name down as I checked to make sure I had enough cash to pay. He showed me up to my room on the 3rd floor. The lone window in the small, hardly furnished room looked out over another cramped square, this one behind the building, and there were hardly enough plugs on the walls to charge my phone and laptop at the same time. There wasn't even a deadbolt on the door, just a lock on the knob, though I could see the marks and outline on the frame from where a bolt had recently been. I looked across the room at another door, which seemed to lead to an adjoining room, and decided to move the bolt on that door over to this one. With the screwdriver attachment on the multi-tool in my bag, it didn't take long. After the tall, bald man brought me up a ham sandwich, silently judging me for avoiding Innsmouth's best-in-the-country seafood, I read the book I had brought for the bus and tried to relax. The feeling of overwhelming doom I had brought back from China still lingered, and each time I coughed, I thought of Professor Lake, his frail chest swelling and emptying with the mechanical movements of the ventilator. I had failed him. Failed myself. My journey into mystery had ended in the cheapest room in a ramshackle hotel. One last shitty vacation before the end of the world. I couldn't sleep, as much because of the guilt as because of my disgust. The smell was everywhere, soaked into the sheets, and each time I heard creaking footsteps on the stairs or in the hall, all I could wonder is how much of the Innsmouth look the other guests had. Then, somewhere after midnight, I heard someone slide a key into the door of my room. The knob slowly turned, then jiggled, and as the person outside fumbled with the lock, I set my book aside and looked down at my shoes. The idea of an honest mistake didn't cross my mind. After a few seconds of cautious, quiet struggle against the deadbolt I had placed, I heard slow footsteps move back down the hall. I had nearly convinced myself I was only being paranoid by the time the next sound came. This time, more footsteps moved up the stairs, heavy and uneven, and when they stopped outside my door and the knob began to rattle again, I started to tie my shoes. They'd know the door was bolted soon, whoever they were, and then they tried to force their way in. It sounded like there were enough of them to get through. I could hear whispers, low, croaking, and gurgling, and one of them grunted in frustration as the door shook. The bolt held. For now. I grabbed my bag and coat and ran into the adjoining room. At the sound of my footsteps, I heard the group outside the room begin to move, some charging to the next door as I sprinted past it, while others threw themselves against the door to my room behind me. I ran to the window and pulled it open in a blind panic. I wasn't sure if I was close enough to the balcony or the sloping roof, but I no longer had the luxury of time. With a quick, gulping breath, I swung my legs over the edge of the windowsill and stood, gripping both sides of the frame as my bag swung heavily on my shoulder. As the door burst open, I jumped out into the air above the street and extended my hands. For a terrified second, I dropped into nothing, and when my arms fell on the balcony railing and wrapped around it, I could have cried. I quickly pulled myself up and over, then looked up at the open window above me just in time to see a shadowy hand recede underneath a bloated face. Maybe the dark was playing tricks on me, but I could have sworn the fingers on the gray, clammy hand were webbed. In a second, I was half running and half crawling towards the fire escape on the far side of the building. When I hit bottom on a small, dark alley, I took a moment to catch my breath. If I ran out onto the cobblestone, the sound of my footsteps would echo for miles. Oh God! They were raising the alarm. In the dark, in the heavy fog, maybe I stood a chance, but I had to get out of here. My attackers had no fear of discovery, no thought of being outnumbered or cowed by any kind of police response. Whatever else I was alone. They had the advantage of surprise, of familiarity, of... I frantically dug in my coat pocket and pulled out the map the cashier at the corner store had drawn me, then held it close to my face so I could make out the lines in the dark. Soon, with a plan of attack and a better idea of my heading, I sidled up to the end of the alley and leaned my head out to look down the street. A crowd of uneven shapes was pouring out of the open back door of the Gilman House, gibbering and shouting to each other in confusion. Their features were indistinguishable, but their crouching, shambling gait chilled me to my core. At the back of the group, I saw a familiar shape, a figure in long, dark robes wearing a jagged, frilled headdress. At the front, a hunched-over figure held a sickly yellow lantern in an extended arm, bobbing and swaying as it led the others out into the street. Through the fog, it almost looked like the hanging lights of an anglerfish, or a bulbous, glowing boil drooping from the swollen wrist of a spindly, twisted hand. I dashed down the alley and turned onto Bates Street, passing a line of ruined houses with boarded-up doors and windows. I tried desperately to keep from imagining what might be inside. I saw a few figures loping through the open square ahead, barely visible in the fog, and I slowed from a run to a walk. Then, I imitated the shambling, dragging walk of the Innsmouth folk and continued into the open, nervously glancing back and forth to see if anyone could pick me out from the rest. In the middle of the square, I turned my head to look down at the docks. In the water, from the reef, a steady flash of bright lights shined towards the shore, and over my shoulder a series of similar signals responded from the roof of the Gilman House. They were communicating, receiving orders. As the signal light cast blinding flashes of brilliant orange from Devil Reef, I saw movement in the water. I squinted, then stared in vacant horror. Past the rotted docks, the sloshing water of the harbor was teeming with life. Endless waves of black shapes were sweeping towards the shore, and still more were writhing, crouching, and hopping on the distant reef, their wet skin gleaming in the moonlight. I started running again. I passed Elliott Street, sprinted past what I prayed were abandoned buildings, and finally reached the collapsed train station. There, I slipped through what was left of the building and exited out onto the overgrown tracks. Luckily, the tracks quickly turned away from the harbor and towards the dense marshes, and soon the town of Innsmouth was out of sight. I climbed up a wet hill and laid down in a patch of tall grass overlooking the road Joe Sargent's bus had driven me in on. I couldn't run anymore, not until I had time to rest, and all I could do now was hope my hiding place was far enough out of town that my pursuers wouldn't think to scour it. The road ran in a long curve out across the hill, where it turned back and passed only 10 or 20 yards from the tall grass concealing me. As I caught my breath, a dense crowd of black figures appeared on the horizon, following the road, and as they approached, the clouds above us cleared to reveal a brilliant full moon. After a few seconds, the smell was unbearable. As the horde of hideous, heaving things surged forward, the noises of the night swelled to a bestial babble of croaking, baying, and barking without the least suggestion of human speech. I thought I had prepared myself to see the worst, the most abnormal the world had to offer. But to look at forms and shapes in which there was no hint of the normal at all? I tried to close my eyes, even as I desperately stifled a wet cough with both hands. What I saw now in the flesh was what man had only once known in fantasy and horror. They moved in a limitless stream, wriggling, hopping, croaking, bleeding, surging monstrously through the spectral moonlight in a grotesque, malignant parade, a fantastic nightmare. Their skin, or flesh, was shiny and slippery, but the ridges on their backs were made of sharp, jagged scales, while their bodies had the general shapes of man. Their heads were the bloated, wide-mouthed faces of fish, covered in pox sores and searing rashes, with massive, bulging eyes that never closed. At the sides of their neck were pulsing, twitching gills, and their long front paws were webbed between curved claws. Some moved on 2 legs, and others on 4, but their baying, guttural voices were unmistakably human. Mercifully, after holding my breath so long to stifle the cough that could have set them upon me again, I passed out. It was the sunlight that woke me up the next morning, and as I made my way towards the nearest town, I tried to convince myself that what I had seen was nothing more than the world's greatest night terror. How could it be anything else? Those things, that procession, an unending horde, moving in the perfect lockstep of an organized mob. They lived as one, moved as one, surged against a common enemy like a wave against the cliffs. In the year since I escaped that awful town, I watched with horror as America failed where they had succeeded. It became a plague ship. There was a slipshod, ineffective parody of a response to the new pandemic. And while hundreds of thousands suffocated in their hospital beds, those with a sworn duty to protect them patted themselves on the back on national television. Was this the humanity I had been so desperate to cling to and protect? A society of desperate, pathetic rats, all scrambling to the top of a pile of shit and suffering? A bucket of crabs dragging down anyone who tried to climb out and break free? I didn't really think so. Or at least I didn't want to. But as the death toll rose, I found myself drowning. I began to stare at myself in the mirror, convinced I could see my eyes swelling and separating, my throat bloating and puffing out. I thought of my uncle, too, who killed himself when I was still young, and the staring, unblinking expression in his bulging eyes that I had always hated. I had done more research since I returned from Innsmouth, combed over my mother's papers with a keener eye and greater knowledge. My grandfather's name, as listed on my mother's birth certificate, was Olmsted, but my grandmother's name was Abel, of the Abel Marshes, descended from the youngest son of old Obed himself. Perhaps that, as much as anything else, is why my uncle ate his gun. Maybe he knew what he'd become if he lived long enough, what parts he'd lose. Maybe he could hear the ocean calling. I knew I could. I could see the city of the deep ones in my dreams, hear the voices of a family I had never known, and one night, as I was learning to tie a noose after my hair started to fall out, I had a sudden moment of horrible clarity. Had they known me in Innsmouth? Would they stop me if I came back, walked into the sea, and swam out to that black, towering reef? And the ones that had gone on, the ones that lived on under the water forever and ever, would they reject me? Or would they welcome me with open arms? The bus ride didn't feel as long the second time, and the smell hardly bothered me. This time, there was no out-of-towner to feel kinship to, no addled drunk to scare me off, and anyone who saw me on those mist-shrouded streets only smiled in the way a distant relative smiles when you see them at a wedding or a funeral. The water was cold, and I knew it would be, but I knew I'd get used to it. My lungs had already been prepared, and I could feel the seams on the sides of my neck pulling open into gills with each gasping breath. As I waded into the waves, all I could think of was the city out there under Devil Reef, the jagged obsidian buildings, and the schools of two-legged fish that swam in and out of them. I was never meant to live among the backstabbing apes, or to die of the illnesses their greed had brought into the world. Their world was dying, their cities burning, and rivers drying up. There was nothing left for Ross Homestead, for any sane man in the world above the waves. It's easier to breathe down here, anyway.
The Shadow over Innsmouth was written and directed by Jonathan Inbody and adapted from the novella of the same name by H.P. Lovecraft. It was edited by Jeffrey Lavin, with music composed and performed by Samantha Hunt. Ross, the narrator, was played by Justin Pope. Charleston Harvey played the cashier, Andy Rich played Zachariah Allen, and Jonathan Inbody played Joe Sargent.
Gray Matter is a Word Search Media production. Any similarities to real people, places, or things is purely coincidental.
If you like the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And support us at patreon.com/graymatterhorror.
Be kind. Rewind.